Yeah. Am I good? Am I ready? Am I going?
Yes, ready to go.
Okay, as Mario said, I'll be talking about Angular 2 and how it'll change the world. So we'll be talking about what Angular is, kind of the history behind Angular, so that way we can get some framework or foundation before getting into Angular 2. We'll be talking about some components in Angular 1 and how they can be implemented in Angular 2. We'll be talking about the tools that are available, some simple syntax in the DOM that Angular 2 is bringing. Touch on a little bit of reactive extensions, a new way to get data, jump into a demo and why use it and when to use it. First off, what is Angular? Well, it's a structural framework for dynamic web applications. It takes the model view, whatever approach is what Angular calls it for the architecture. And then it's a way to decouple your DOM manipulation from your application logic. And also, it seems really popular for creating single-page applications. Okay, before we jump into it, I want to kind of give some definitions of and some things that Angular, some terminology, I guess. So first off, an Angular service is usually used to reuse and share data between your other components. Also, an Angular directive is a way to create like a custom HTML tag or element. That way we can reuse that on the page or within the application. An Angular controller is where we actually add our business logic to our application. And since Angular 2 is using TypeScript, I kind of want to touch on that. And it's kind of a superset of JavaScript. It transpiles your code into JavaScript. That way the browser will be able to recognize it. It also brings types and classes to JavaScript. So that way you can better debug before you even run your program.
But we don't have any questions because we all remember your Pechakucha.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. Blake
stairs. So some history behind Angular. It was the first commit that I found on the changelog was from 2010. And it's kind of cool that they named some of their releases. So the first one was Dragon Breath. And then their first actual release was a couple years later. This brought a lot of changes here for this one, and where they're kind of getting rid of a widget or a attribute widget and just combining it all into a directive. And then Angular 2 Alpha came out in 2015, and that's when we were able to start playing around with Angular 2 and see what the future of Angular is going to be like. And then Angular 2 Beta came out in 2015, and then you can see that the latest Angular and Angular 1 and 2 are being worked on concurrently. Angular 1 has been bringing in features that are going to be in Angular 2. That way it'll be easier to upgrade when you're ready to, when Angular 2 actually comes out fully. So here we'll see some Angular 1 syntax versus Angular 2. So this is kind of the way we would used to set up our controllers or our services. So we're just telling it what module we want to use. We're giving the factory name, which is the actual service name. And then we're injecting our Angular services that we want to use here. And in this instance, we're just using HTTP. That way we can pull data in some way. And then I'm just defining a function called getHeroes. And then I'm returning the promise to that in that function to pull in the data. In Angular 2, it's a little different. So we're injecting, for a code injection, we have to actually just import it like you would see in other type of languages. And then we're creating a class. Here it's called injectable instead of a service or a factory. And then we're just making a function similar like we did before as getHeroes. And because Angular 2 uses reactive extensions by default, I'm going to return a promise, just to make it a little simpler, and kind of so I don't have to jump into reactive extensions and how much different they are compared to promises and callbacks.
Why is the syntax of that totally different?
Why is this? It's in TypeScript, so it looks a lot different than Angular 1, and with Angular 2, they're rewriting the whole code base.
Was one written in TypeScript?
No, I think you had the option.
I mean, was Angular itself written in TypeScript?
Angular 1? I don't think so. That might have even been before TypeScript was out. I think TypeScript was out in 2012, and Angular started around 2009, 2010. So here we can see our directive. We're just naming our directive HR app, and then inside your DOM, you would just reference that by saying HR-app, which is similar to other HTML tags that you would use. This one's just a custom one that we're making. And then here we're restricting it to only be able to use element. That way we can just reuse it as an element, and we don't have to worry about if a user uses that as an attribute or any other type. And then we're just defining our HTML here. And here I'm just taking a variable that I'm setting here, and then I'm just repeating it, and it creates a new list item for every time around. And then I'm just showing the name of that particular hero. And this is where I'm calling my service. So I'm just calling my service, and then I'm doing this callback. And then once I get data from the service, however it's getting it, and then I actually set the scope, which is what you can reference inside of your DOM structure. That's just a way to indicate that it's an Angular service. Yeah. And it's not that way in Angular 2, which we'll see in the next slide. So here we're importing our dependency injections, and then is where we're doing that call to the service. And we have to actually tell Angular that I want to do this after the function has been created. So before we were able to just do that whenever the controller is ran. But here we have to actually tell it on init when this class is done being created, then we can run this callback and get our heroes here. And we're doing arrow syntax here, if that looks kind of new. What it's doing is it's setting the heroes object, or passing in the heroes object, and then we're just returning this line of code. And notice we're not using scope anymore here. We're just getting a reference to this instead of using $scope that we would do in Angular 1. And then here we're doing the same kind of thing. We'll kind of walk through that a little bit here in a minute and kind of explain the syntax behind our templates.
Is that like a lambda expression, basically? What it looks like?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So is it because you're importing stuff that you don't have to do like an inline call to $scope? Because you're actually pulling it into that page and letting it run the scope of that page?
Yeah, instead of using scope, we can actually just use this here. So I'm setting my heroes variable here and telling it that I want to use the hero class like you would in regular class or object-oriented languages. And then I'm just importing that class up here. Yeah. Yeah. And then here's some DOM syntax that we saw a little bit in the last slide in our template. But this kind of gives us a good way to indicate what the DOM structure is actually doing. In Angular 1, you kind of had ng model, which was a two-way binding. You did an ng for or ng repeat that didn't really, you knew it created DOM elements, but you didn't have any indication just looking at the DOM structure. So here we can, you'd access the data the same way using the mustache syntax, but when we pull in variables from some kind of other directive, or pushing in variables to the directive we're using, we can use the square bracket syntax, and then the input value is just the right side of it. Similar thing with any kind of output. We're going to do parentheses instead. So usually those are used for some kind of event, like a click event, or you can use key up or something similar. You can also create your own. And then you can create a variable in HTML. Before, with ng repeat, you just kind of told it to create the variable. When you say whatever name of the variable in whatever array. Here we can actually see that the hashtag actually creates that variable for you, so you can kind of see it before you run it, which is kind of what we're doing here. We're creating this hashtag hero of heroes, and then we can repeat that for every time around on the li element. And then Angular will create a new template anytime the star is used. So for instance, ng-if tells you if this variable is true, or this statement is true, then show this template. If not, don't show it. Which we're doing also in the ng4. We have star ng4, which is going to create a new template for each time around for that li element. And then a way to do two-way binding, best example is using ng model. So here we're doing square bracket and parentheses. It's a way to do two-way binding between our JavaScript and our DOM structure, or your different directives. So I'll touch on reactive extensions a little bit. Before, we would use promises or callbacks. And it's kind of like you tell the server you want data, and then once it comes back, you're done with the promise. If you want to call it again, you have to create a new promise or a callback. The way we use reactive extensions is it's more of a stream. So you can send multiple messages through a stream. You kind of just open it up using an observable, and then wherever you need data, you're just going to subscribe to that. And then once some kind of data gets pushed in, you're going to be able to get that data from the subscription. And that's kind of, it's instead of pulling data, you would think of it more of pushing, because you're pushing it to the observable and then getting it in the subscription. And the tools that are available, Angular I/O uses just the npm scripts and Light Server, which is forked off of Browser Sync if you're familiar with that. It's nice because it has live reloading that you would expect from a JavaScript framework or a tool. You can also use Gulp and Grunt, as well as Webpack, which a lot of examples seem to be using. But I still haven't found the best one that I like. So I'm kind of trying to play around with a little bit of them and find the one I like the best. Then let's get to the demo. Yeah, it's they're thinking of parent to child kind of binding instead of the two-way binding between parent and child directives. Angular 1 now, actually, you can use that if you update to 1.5. So when you create an isolated scope, you can use I think it's an angle bracket instead of the equal sign, and then it'll bring data down, and it won't update the parent data at all. So I thought, since we're at Code and Beer, the best kind of API to use was something about beer. So, so here, this is just, we're pulling in 50 different beers, and then we can search on that. And this is just the Angular 1 way, if you're familiar with it, using an ng model. And then we're just doing a search on there. And then here's where we're actually utilizing streams. We're going to be requesting to the server that we want some data, and we're going to actually do a search. And then instead of closing that callback or promise, we can just keep that stream open, and whenever you start typing, it'll start searching the server directly. So if I type in some beer name, it'll call back, bring back, and it'll update the DOM for me. And, yeah, I think Brewery DB API is what I'm using. So if you want a honey boo boo drink, there you go.
I don't think anyone wants a honey boo boo. Is it a beer that looks like a thumb?
I don't know, but I started playing around with this. I'm like, I don't know why I typed in boo boo, but I was like, I got to use an example of this one. So I stumbled upon this API. I know it's not related to beer, but it was really fun. So if I type in hello friend, it'll translate it into pirate talk. So there we go.
You have to say it like a pirate now.
Yep.
Come on, Brady.
No.
Mario? A vast mate. A vast mate.
Come on, Kevin, you can pull it off.
I probably could.
So if we So if we jump into the code here, we're just importing any or the scripts that Angular's using, like you would expect, and then we're just using this root directive, which we'll define in our main file, which I'm telling Angular using system.js to look for the main file in my app folder, and then just looking for the main file. And then in here, there's a lot of stuff going on. We're importing all the things we need for our application, and then we're defining a component, just a root component. This was actually just used for the navigation. So here we can see our links that we're using, and we're just inputting the router link here. And then inside of my router config is where I actually define the routes that I want to use. So my route is actually just going to go to just redirect to home. And inside of home, it's just I can specify the component that I want to use. So here we're using the beer app component, and then so on for the other two. And then with Angular 2, you have to bootstrap it manually. If you're familiar with Angular 1, you could just use ng-app on whatever element that you want, and then just give it a name, and that's your module name. Here we have to bootstrap it manually, which is it's not too bad, but it's just a little different than Angular 1.
All the imports into, not the imports, was that the HTML page? There's a long list of JavaScript files. Is that fairly normal for an Angular app?
Angular 2 has a lot more dependencies than Angular 1. I'm not sure if they were going to minimize it later. Maybe we can just use an Angular file or just an Angular JS file. But just for this one, yeah, because they're using ES6 shim, they're using polyfills, and they're using system.js to do like the stuff we did on the index file for the modules. And then we need reactive extensions. And the HTTP and router is something separate in Angular, so you have to actually import those as well, which I had trouble with that because in some of the tutorials I was using, it didn't specify that, and you didn't have to do that in Angular 1.
Well, that's no different than a NuGet package in .NET.
Well, that's kind of what I'm wondering. So even from like a tooling standpoint, if you want to use reactive extensions, are you going and typing in, I want to use reactive extensions, or are you doing like going to NPM and saying, hey, I want to do reactive and searching, and it pulls everything in for you?
Yeah, actually in the tutorial on Angular's website, you just define your package.json, and then you do an npm install, and then you just have to include it here. I think if you're using Gulp, it'd be much better because you can automate that a little bit. So when you build your prod environment or your dev environment, you can just do Gulp prod, and it'll move only the ones that you need into some kind of library folder, and then you just reference them in there.
And that was like
If they may couple it, that'd probably be a bad idea.
Okay, moving on. So here we're defining the service similar to what we did in the previous slides. Here all I care about is translating my English to Pirate because I really want to talk some Pirate. So I'm just defining the term that I want, and it has to be a string. With TypeScript, you're not really going to see this on the runtime. You're not going to see any kind of runtime errors with this, but it helps with your IDE and debugging before jumping into the browser. And then here we're just, since we're using reactive extensions out of the box with the HTTP service, I'm just transferring that into a promise for simplicity's sake. And then we can do the callback on the component.
So does injectable that may have any kind of like, again, back to the kind of dependency, can you say, hey, if I don't have this installed, then I can't call this class to deliver to my application?
So like this HTTP, if you want to, like if this isn't available, then do something else. Is that what you're saying? Like if that dependency isn't there, you can throw an error.
Right.
I'm not sure. So maybe in your constructor you could tell, but also you're going to get a flagged error if in your IDE before even transpiling it to JavaScript to see, oh, okay, I didn't, like if I would remove HTTP from here, we're going to get an error saying it's not available. So
Maybe I'm looking at the word inject too much.
yeah. Well, so in Angular 1, when you're creating a service or a factory, you're kind of making an injectable program. So that's kind of, or class. So they just named it injectable this time around instead of a factory or service. So inside of here is where the magic happens. So we're defining our template. That way we can see the pirate talk. And then here, it's a little different to make my variable. Like in the ng4, it's like, okay, well, I have to make a variable. But here I'm kind of using it differently. So here I'm just adding it to the input element. And that way I can reference it later when I want to pull the value from there. Instead of putting like an ng model on there, this is a little more performant. And you can see here we're using that value inside of our click event for when we click on the translate button.
So you're getting a reference to the DOM element?
Yes, and that's why I have to transfer it to a value. Whereas if you're using ng4, it will create an object for you because you're telling it this variable for this array. Also, I forgot to explain the styles here. It's kind of interesting that they added this. This styles tag will only be used in this component. So if you define pirate somewhere else, it's not going to conflict with this at all. So I use that in my main file for the UL element, so I could kind of demonstrate that I'm using that across the board and not have to override everything.
Do you know if that generates a CSS file that's included, or just inline styles? Or?
I'll show you, and I can show the DOM structure in a minute. They're kind of referencing it a little different. They're creating a new attribute on every component that you're using. Okay, so similar to the slides, I'm just taking that callback and I'm setting the pirate text to what I'm getting back from the server. If we jump in here, I can show you, not like that. Show you how those styles are made. Yeah. Good? Oh. Good?
Up the prescription
Oh, and the person that asked the question left the building. So Angular adds this ng host, which is our main directive that we're making in the index file. And then it's adding each one of these to the elements. That's why it's referencing those styles. Let me find one that's being used. Actually, let me go to here.
A custom element that, like if you hover over your app, what does it say in the user agent on the right side?
Where at?
Over there, yeah, if you scroll up or down.
It's-
Wait, it says,
I don't see it. Oh, and computed? If we see it here, that's what I'm getting at, is here. So over here on the right is the one that I'm defining in my component. Oh, that is for the navigation up here. So let me find the right one. So I'm using ULs also down here for this component, for each element here. So if I inspect that and then go up to the LI, there's how they're referencing the CSS.
but it's saying it's from a style. Where does that style live? Oh, it's just injected.
There you go.
It's possible to reference a CSS file separately.
Yeah, you can do a styles URL and use that. Okay, and I think that's all I have for the demo.
Was the name of the pirate API RPI? Like RPI? I think I caught it right the last when he switched. It is. Look at that.
I didn't recognize that.
Some of this new syntax looks very PHP.
Yeah.
Bigger, it's like,
For TypeScript, you mean?
now some of the new bracket stuff, is there any, like, ECMAScript requirement for any of that, or is that, like, backwards compatible at all?
Well, in TypeScript, you can tell it to use a different ECMAScript. So I think by default, it's using 5. So it just, when it does the translation or transpilation, it's just compiling that down to ES5.
Is 2 one you know in TypeScript versus JavaScript?
Well, I'm sorry, what?
So, do you have to know TypeScript to use 2 well?
I think so. Like, I kind of learned that first before jumping into Angular. So I kind of knew a little bit of it before I even started learning Angular. That's kind of a dependency I wanted to learn first.
Okay, Brady, when you switch over here, I want to make sure that you come to.
Shiver down my spine when you mentioned PHP.
Can you switch the screen to the other screen? So it's on that one.
What do you mean?
Open source.
Is that good? I used slideshow like you said before.
It's fine.
Okay. So I think a big reason of why to use Angular 2, that's kind of the reason I have this performance chart, is performance reasons. If you watched Mario's presentation, or if you didn't, you can talk to him more about performance. But here's the performance of Angular 1 compared to Angular 2. If you're using an ng repeat, Angular 1, if you use track by, kind of works, or is a lot faster. But Angular 2, I don't believe it uses track by, and it's much faster than Angular 1. I think another reason is using Angular 2 is TypeScript. I really like it. It's nice to be able to debug more before you get into runtime errors. compared to JavaScript. And when should you use it? Well, not just yet. I think it's not stable enough. It's still in beta, so maybe hold off before actually using it. But do learn it. I really like it.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. I was watching.
Oh.
You're the dog and the cat is Angular 2.
Granted, that was my complaint, or the complaint about my Pechacucha with all my cat gifs. No one listened to anything I said. They were just watching.
I hesitated putting it in, but I found the perfect GIF. I'm like, I can't pass it up.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think that's it. I put it on GitHub. I'll push my latest changes if anybody wants to see it. I was going to put it on Plunker or something that you can run in the browser, but I couldn't find anything good that was able to use TypeScript yet. And then Q&A.
Do you know why it's so much faster? What they, well, two, I think it's related. First of all, why the complete rewrite or complete 2.0 that is not backward compatible, right? And you know, performance. Any idea what's the basis for the improvements?
I think for performance, things got abused. So like when you're filtering like a ng repeat, you can tell it to order or tell it to sort, and it sorts on the event or on like watches. So it actually does it quite often, and it takes a performance hit doing that sorting a lot, even though it's not even doing anything, or it's not changing the DOM at all. Also on the same, also for performance, I think there's other things that got hit by that, like the order by is no longer in Angular 2, and also like the track by, you don't have that problem with Angular 1. You have to like put the track by on there, so Angular will have a unique identifier for each time creating new elements for ng repeat. And also Angular 2 kind of abused using two-way binding a lot. So if you have a parent directive that's communicating with a child directive, it's constantly doing an event to update those.
You mean Angular 1 abused it?
Yeah, Angular 1 did.
And if you look at Angular 1's track by in that chart, it was pretty close to Angular 2. So Angular 2 is just doing what Angular 1 should have done. So if you look, you see the blue bar for Angular 1. The next one is the orange is Angular 1 track by. So Angular 2 is just doing what Angular 1 should have done.
Looks like Angular 1 track by is actually faster.
It just did.
Slightly, but there's a lot more to this performance benchmark.
Yeah.
For the next few years.
There's a lot more to this benchmark that I pulled this from that kind of gives Angular 2 a little better, still better than Angular 1, and more than just one. There's a lot of charts, and I figured JavaScript would be the best one to put on here.
I think we should blur out the React and Ember references.
Yeah, so React looks like it's faster than both of them. Why wouldn't I use React?
Well, I think React is more lightweight and more of a library than it is a framework. So Angular gives you a lot more than React would. It'd be better to compare. It'd be better to compare a library like jQuery to React because it's more lightweight.
What's impressive is that a full framework like Angular 2 is really close to React, which is a very tiny library.
Yeah.
Comparatively.
And another thing, why Angular has changed so much is JavaScript's changed so much since it first came out.
Yeah.
Like JavaScript from the last 3 versions of Akamai are completely different. And also like TypeScript, that was a weird debate that happened in the community for about a year and a half, and that's why Angular 2 is taking so long to come out.
Because I think a lot of people were
Before TypeScript. Angular 2. JavaScript? Start, right?
before for Angular 2.
Start, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, they were using Dart before they moved to TypeScript. So it actually went through 2 different rewrites before it went to this version of it.
But I still.
Like one of the lead developers quit over the TypeScript choice, right?
Yeah. And Microsoft is TypeScript, which is weird.
Yeah, that's what I started Aria.
Well, finally Google's learning.
Okay. Look for tools. I know that,
Angular?
Yes.
yeah, Angular 2 has assertions, so you can do like assert type of blah blah blah, assert all, whatever. So there's some kind of basic testing kind of built into it. And then I know that their dependency injection library, it's isolated, I guess. So you can actually take that library and use it in a JavaScript project that isn't in Angular 2.0. So that's some interesting stuff. It's more of an added package like Wizard or whatever. Yeah. So some interesting things about dependency injection as well.
So,
Go ahead.
that was it.
Angular, oh, go ahead. I was going to say, Angular 2 does get rid of like the things that were getting abused, like order by, and what's the other one? The filter one, where you could do filter and then query on an ng model or something, because that would take up a lot of performance hit. For my example that I'm showing a list of beers and then I'm searching on that, I actually had to make my a custom filter for that, and then it's just looking on the name.
So if we're gonna start a new project using Angular, which will we use?
I think right now it's still Angular 1, because I don't think Angular 2 is ready, because it's going through so much changes still with the beta.
1.5 for sure.
Well, yeah, it's nice to have some components that are going to be used in Angular 2 there, because you can actually define components now instead of a directive, which is slightly different. Yeah. Yep.
Two-part question. If you have an Angular 1 project and you want to, how would you start preparing for Angular 2? And the second part of my question, what is this JavaScript you keep speaking of?
I don't know. I've never used it before.
Okay.
Never heard of it before.
It's Java for the web.
Yeah.
A smaller version of Java.
I think just taking advantage of the components that are coming out that are Angular 2, that are preparing you for Angular 2, like using the component, using one-way binding is a huge difference. So I think just taking advantage of Angular 1 components that are going to be used in Angular 2 is the biggest approach, I think.
It's still my question,
Yeah.
but outside of like if you should be using it today, if you were redesigning an application and it was a new pipeline, would you rather hold off and wait until Angular 2 came out, or start in Angular 1 today?
I think I would rather hold off, because that's going to be a lot of refactoring. I mean, all of the syntax is going to change, and I think it's going to take a lot of work to upgrade an Angular 1 to an Angular 2 app.
Do you, because I haven't heard this, but do you know expected release dates?
I'm not sure. If you look at the timeline, I think some people are kind of trying to predict when it's going to come out. So the first commit for Angular 1, that's when they first put it on GitHub even, is 2010. And then the first release was in 2012. So hopefully end of this year, maybe next year. I don't know. They should just release it just for your birthday.
Is this your diplohatlatonic meiosis birthday?
I think they're holding off.
Alex, what does that mean?
Yep.
Something with solid
I had a testing question for Angular. How do you recommend testing if it's not the DOM manipulation on a single page app? Like, how do you do something like Jasmine for Angular?
That guy's the guy to talk to. He does testing more than me.
Which guy?
Mario.
Okay.
We're doing testing now in our Angular app, but
How do you do it, Mario?
Jasmine.
You can do Jasmine?
Yeah, right now with Angular 1, you can use Jasmine for your unit testing. All TDD based, you can inject stuff.
Nice.
You can log things using Jasmine's fine.
I haven't got into the testing for Angular 2 yet.
Okay.
But I think they're still using Jasmine.
Okay.
But I'm not sure.
Cool. So obviously you're not doing TDD then. So.
I am kind of with Mario, but
What's the browser support?
whatever you want it to be. I'm just kidding. You're whatever ECMAScript you want to go to, because you can tell Angular.
How far back in ECMA does it go again?
I know for TypeScript you can go to 3, but I'm not sure about Angular 2 itself.
So that would have been years today.
What
So
year is it?
That was like 5 years ago, so browsers from like 5 years ago, 4 years ago? IE10. IE9, 10, yeah, so that, yeah. That makes sense. So not like full, not just the initial HTML5, but a little bit guys.
Yeah, I haven't tested it in any old browsers, so I should find that out for you.
Can you make it work in IE8?
No.
That should always be the response.
Performance benchmark on that one.
My God.
Anyone else? Booth?
Does IE9?
What's an 99?
Goes back to now.
Yeah.
Slow clap Mario?